Thank you, Lassi. Yeah, thanks for staying so long. I know it's been a long and fruitful day. Hopefully you have energy for a few more. So our chief design officer, Jesse, tore his Achilles tendon playing football. So hopefully I'll make it through this talk without any injuries. I'm the last sub we have. A few years ago, our design team at Idean booked a hotel off the coast of Norway. And while they did that, they also asked this ship captain to give them a call when the weather got really bad, when the conditions were as bad as they pretty much get in Norway. I don't know if you can hear the sound, but this is actual footage from the ship when our designers got on board. And the reason they did that was that we were working for a client to design the experience of controlling ships under hazardous conditions. And of course, they poured through a lot of the data to understand what it's like to operate that ship. Statistics on weather patterns and kind of what does a day look like for a person operating this vessel. But the reason they went still on that vessel was to get that kind of deep empathy and intrinsic understanding for what it's like to operate that vessel. And it was really a combination of that data with that more sort of human empathy for what it's like to actually operate in that context. And that's a topic of my talk this afternoon. So data with soul and how we could actually combine data with empathy. And I'll share a few stories from our work and how we've done it. So I think this ties back to kind of understanding both the rational and emotional side of the human experience and combining qualitative and quantitative data for what some people call hybrid insights. And it's been a concept or kind of thought that's been talked about a lot in the last few years. And I thought I'd share a few principles and stories of how we've done it. So the first principle is that quantitative data is really good at giving you a big picture of the terrain. Whatever kind of the context that you're designing for, data can really help you understand the big picture. And we often use this at the beginning of engagements to sort of understand the lay of the land of what we're solving for. And data can really help you uncover where the opportunities are and see kind of where the leverage points are where you can have the biggest impact. So things we look at often are, for example, what are the interesting trends in the data? What are the most common use cases? Or, for example, where does the money come from? I've had the pleasure of working with the city of Helsinki quite a bit over the last few years. And one of the things that we've tried to answer together with the city of Helsinki is, what's the experience of visiting Helsinki like? So of course we poured through a lot of quantitative data around that. So what are the visitor trends? What does the time spent, money spent look like in Helsinki? What are the average routes that people take when they come to Helsinki? So that's been on the quantitative side. But then of course we wanted to understand the human side of it as well. I'll get back to that in a second. But one of the more interesting trends that we looked at was that the growth of Chinese visitors in Helsinki has been around 30% year on year for the last few years. And that led us to work on a project that I'll talk to you in a bit about. So once you understand that sort of big picture with data, you understand where are the opportunity areas, then we often like to go deeper than with qualitative insights to get a deeper empathy and understand what is actually the human experience side of it. And this has been said often, but it still bears repeating. So data is really good at telling you what people do and what happens. And then interviews and observations kind of tell the other side of the story of why people behave in the ways that they do, which are often not rational. And qualitative insights, when you really get deep into them, they're sort of a smörgåsbord or buffet of inspiration. And I think it ties back to how our brains are built, that we're really hardwired to connect with people one-on-one and kind of understand their context and relate to them in a way that we really can't do with data. So again, from our Helsinki experience, we looked at that quantitative data that I talked about. Then we looked at the qualitative side. What are the fears, what are the frustration, what are the joys of visiting Helsinki? one of the ways that we did this, and focusing on Chinese visitors, was that together with our Chinese designer Yifan, who's hidden here in the picture, we created this way of research in it where we gave Chinese visitors a map of Helsinki. And then we asked them for a few days to put on the map kind of smiley faces for what were the good experiences and frowny faces for when things didn't really work out on their trip. And then we also asked them to take Polaroid pictures of their visit. And then a few days after, we went back to these folks and we asked them to walk through their experience in visiting Helsinki. And again, it was really this combination of those two sides and points of view. So that quantitative data and then that qualitative data that led to our solutions. And what we ended up working on, together with Tencent, the city of Helsinki, and then also WIM, we created an experience that would help these Chinese visitors find the best things to do in Helsinki, then get around with WIM, which was, based on our interviews, really the biggest pain point for them. It's really a big hassle to use public transportation where you don't speak Finnish, not necessarily even English, and you're not used to, for example, paying things necessarily with your credit card, or you don't have a Western credit card. So this app could enable and does enable them to move around easily with WIM and then pay for everything with WeChat Pay. So another example from Idean life, and this is already a few years ago, but we were asked by a Swedish mining company called Sandvik to design the experience of a mine drill. And it's not really within the realm of sort of designers' everyday life that you think about how do you operate in mines. And we got a lot of quantitative data about how mine drills are used and mines and everything. But then me got there in between these two guys from our design team. He was a really brave soul and kind of took one for the team, and he spent a few weeks in Moroccan mines to understand what it's like to actually operate in those conditions. So it was pitch black, about 40 degrees Celsius, and there's poisonous acid that's dropping from the ceiling, and Mika's not even wearing gloves for some reason. But it really took that kind of understanding of that context combined with the data that enabled him to design the solutions that he did. When they came back to Helsinki then to work on the design, whenever they tested things, whether they work or not in the UI, they went into the bathroom and cut all the lights so they could see whether it would work in the Moroccan context. So once you understand that big picture from data, you understand what are the big opportunity areas, and then you go deeper, you kind of color in that picture with qualitative insights. Then what we found is often useful is to loop back to the data. Look at, can our qualitative findings, kind of the initial findings that we have from the data, can they be generalized or backed up by data? So often what you get from interviews, when you do qualitative interviews, let's say you do 6 or 8, you don't really get definite truths from there, but you get kind of your first hunches or inklings of what the direction could be. Then it's often useful to dig into the data or do some A/B testing to validate that. So this is abstracted a little bit, but an example from previous life is that we had an idea that from the interviews that instructional content could be valuable to users and the business as well. But then we wanted to explore from data whether that would make sense or not. And then we actually looked at the instructional content and we saw that people who consume it and spend time with it also have a 25% higher average order value, which I think it's not perfect science, but it gives you some kind of indication that this might be perfect, might be a good solution. So the fourth principle that we found useful is to, whenever you're in a situation where you need to tell a story, for example, you're communicating about a strategy or an upcoming concept, or there's something that you want to communicate internally, it's really useful to kind of borrow from both worlds, so combine qualitative and quantitative insights into it. And this is an example that we worked with Finnair this spring on digital strategy. And Finnair is really advanced in using data to drive design decisions and to drive their strategy and development. And of course, we brought a lot of that data into our process and into the arguments of the strategy. But we also wanted to communicate the human side of the experience. So that's why one of the ways that we communicated the strategy was through a short film where we looked at through a Japanese person and a Finnish person's life how Finnair could impact them in a few years. And I think it did a really good job of kind of communicating combined with those data. So what I would recommend is try to bring data alive with those human stories. Because it's often, when you communicate with people, it's the data that can convince people, sort of speak to their rational side, but it's often the stories that people resonate better with and are sort of moved and touched by better. So those were the four principles from past life that we've learned from combining quantitative and qualitative data. So try to get the big picture with quantitative data, then dive deeper to kind of color in that picture with qualitative insights. Then when you have that first hunch, try to look back to data and see, can you generalize these findings with data? And then when you want to communicate a direction or a strategy, try to combine kind of best of both worlds. And it's really an iterative process between these. So I present these in sequence, but it's more of a kind of ongoing dance between finding things out from interviews and observations, then going back to quantitative data, and doing this as you go along in the process. That helps you get a deeper understanding. And I've also kind of observed that people tend to kind of fall into either or camp. So they're really big believers in qualitative insights, service design, design thinking, that sort of world, and kind of understanding people in their context. And you have people who are really staunch believers in data. So if you're in either of these camps, I think it's really useful to also learn and kind of understand the vocabulary and tools of the other world so that you can bridge these worlds when needed. And as a final note, I think if you come to conferences like these nowadays, it was the Joint Futures last week and this today, I think it's really nice to see that design is being used to solve even more challenging tasks than before and sort of wicked systemic issues. And I think to do that well, you need deeper understanding. It's not enough to skim the surface with data or do some interviews, but you really need to get deeper. And I think for that, it's good to inject a bit of soul into our data. Cheers.
Thanks, Matias. This was an excellent presentation in terms of actually saving some of the time from for the rest of the afternoon. But I think it still might warrant a couple of questions or comments from the audience. Do we have anything anyone wants to add or ask? Matias? I don't see anything happening over there, so let me bring up my own question for once and for all. What I'd like to ask that you discussed about this kind of validation of the kind of ideas that you might receive in qualitative work. For instance, reflecting on the cases that you presented here or some other work you've done, do you often encounter kind of surprises in terms of the alignment of what you were expecting based on the kind of earlier research and when you try to then kind of validate it? And how do you kind of what do you kind of do if you have some sort of stark contrast between what people have said and what they do, as in terms of what Kaisa was talking earlier, that it mightn't always be perfectly aligned, even though you'd like it to be?
Yes, the short answer is yes. You do get surprises, and of course you can validate things on very different levels and in different ways. But what we often try to do is validate those things and our hypothesis early enough so that you don't fall in love and the kind of hypotheses don't become too personal and too political in the organization, because if they do, then sort of the validation becomes trickier. So validate them often and kind of have hypotheses that you hold on to quite loosely, and then look at the data or do some other type of validation with a pretty broad and open mind. Any comments? Anyone want to add or perhaps disagree?
I think what Matias presented is very well aligned with all the rest of the stuff that we've been seeing going here. So this is probably not something that anyone is eager to disagree with. I might ask that. Okay, well, no, I will skip that because I think because now is our chance to kind of catch up with schedule. So let's thank Matias for once more coming on a short notice.
Thank you.